In this video, we're going to add one more behavior, state machine behavior, to our scene, and that is going to be a counter behavior. This counter behavior is then going to tilt the table up gradually in our scene so that as you progress through this VR or virtual reality experience, it'll progressively get more difficult and faster moving. We are going to learn about state machine behaviors, events, and counter actions. So let's get started. All right, I'm back here in my scene. If you remember in the last video, what we did was we added several different behaviors, and they're all tied together using events. So to start the game, we were waiting. When we played the scene, it's waiting for us to click or touch, if we're in VR, this start button, and once it does, it emits a message, start. The game ball behavior is listening for that start message, and once it hears it, it will then execute a script that will define the ball as having gravitational pull. It'll then transition to this random state, which randomly goes to either this blue reposition state or this orange reposition state, which both will change the color, respectively, to either orange or blue. Execute this script's expression that is defining the ball as blue or orange, and then it is moving on to this wait for trigger state. So it is waiting for the ball to enter into one of these buckets. So the ball will enter into the trigger box that is attached to these buckets. And what those are actually, it's actually waiting for those triggers by listening for those into bucket blue or into bucket orange, which are then emitted by the blue. Let me show that. The blue or orange trigger behaviors. So once it hears those, it will then continue on and go back to this random state and kind of continue this loop. So we have multiple behaviors here that are all interacting with one another. That's what we did in the last video. In this video, it's going to be a little bit shorter. What we're going to do is create a behavior that will start tilting this table based on successful drops into the bucket. Okay, so the entity we need to add a behavior to is actually the table offset. Now this is actually, what we're doing here is the reason why we created this table with an offset. If we remember, when we created the table, the center of the table is here in the middle. We then put the table offset to be at the edge of the table. That is so that when this starts rotating, the table's edge will stay in the same place because it's rotating around this axis right here. Otherwise, if we added it just directly to the table itself, it would tilt, and then so the table would actually dip down lower and get higher on the other side, which is not what we wanted. We wanted the edge to stay at the same place. That's why we added this table offset, is for this particular behavior to work in the way we wanted it to. So we're going to add the behavior to this table offset. We'll click Add Component. And then down to state machine, we're going to add a new behavior, and we're just going to call this tilt behavior. All right. Let's move this state over. And we are going to add what is the first thing we're adding to this one? We're adding a listen state to this, and we're going to add action. And we're listening. We're going to look for the listen action itself. We're going to add the message into bucket blue. We're going to add action, add another listen action. I'm just going to copy and paste this. Except we're going to change it from blue to orange. So that means that every time it hears the message into bucket blue or into bucket orange, which is emitted when the ball drops into either one of these buckets, it'll then transition to something else. And the next state we need to add, we'll add a state we're going to call incremental counter. And the action we're looking for is incremental counter. So this is creating an actual counter that's going to account an event or an action from happening. And there's all these different words that I want to use them carefully. So it's not an event in the sense of an event being a message event being emitted, but an event as like an occurrence or something occurring within the scene. So we're going to name this counter correct drops. correct drops. And we do want this to count just by 1. We're going to unselect the on every frame. And then if you notice, there's no transition here, so we do need to add a transition action. Okay, the next state we will add is a compare counter. So we'll call this state compare counter. And we will add action and look for compare counter. The compare counter that we want to look at, remember we named this incremental counter. We named it correct drops. So the counter that we're comparing is correct drops. The value that it's going to be looking for is 3. You can make this whatever you want, but I'm just making it so that every 3 times it cycles through this compare counter, it can do something based on that value. We then want to add another state. We'll move it over here, and we're going to call this rotate. And we're going to add action. You can do tween rotate. You can do tween rotate or just rotate. It doesn't really matter which one. The difference between tween, rotate, and just rotate is that with it, rotate will just, on a single frame, will just rotate it automatically, so it'll jump from one rotation to another rotation. Tween rotate will show you the change from one rotation to the next. So we'll actually kind of animate it, which is what we want to do. I'm going to do 2 degrees, so not a whole lot. The time I want this to take, I want it to be very quick. We'll just say 70 milliseconds. That's not a whole lot of time. But we do want to just show some sort of animation. I'll leave it as linear. The easing type and direction, I'll leave that as is. Okay, and then the last state we need to add, we'll add one more state. So we need to reset the counter. Again, I will describe everything that's going on here in just a moment. The action we want to add is a set counter. And the counter we want to be able to reset is correct drops. And we'll reset the value. Because we're resetting it, we want the value to go back to 0. If you notice, there's no transition here on this state, so we need to add a transition action. Okay, so what is happening here? Every time the ball drops into one of these buckets, and a message is emitted, either the into bucket blue or the into bucket orange, and then both of these will then go to the incremental counter. So once it passes through this counter, this behavior is counting as 1. It then will transition to, get this one out of the way, the compare counter. The compare counter is then saying, what's the value of the incremental counter? If it is less than, if you notice it down here where it says is less than X or is less than 3, it'll transition back to listen, and then it'll listen. So if then next time it hears that message or the trigger is entered, it'll then count another one, and it'll go to here, and it'll say, well, it's 2 now, but it's still less than 3, so it'll go back here. And then once it goes to here again for a third time, so every 3 drops, essentially, it's going to go here. Then it's going to say, oh, on correct drops equals X or equals 3. That's going to transition over to this rotate. So essentially, every time it goes to every 3 correct drops, so really just 3 drops into the bucket, it's going to then go to the rotate and then rotate the table up a little bit, of which after it rotates it, it's going to transition back to reset counter, and it'll reset the counter back to 0 so that you can start all over again, and then that will transition back to this listen. So let's see how this works. I'm going to press play. So to get it all going, I need to press the play button. All right, so we get an orange ball. Drop it into the orange bucket. You see it's listening. Now what happened here It happened very quickly. Let me back up. It is transitioning through all these. It's just happening really, really quickly. It's like, you know, it's 60 frames per second, so then it's happening 1/60th of a second. So it really is going through this behavior quickly. But if you did notice that on the third one, it did go to the rotate and rotated, but you couldn't see it very well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this, let's go 6, and let's make it take 500. I'm just doing this, making these changes just so we can see it here in the video. So if you have, I wouldn't make these changes right now, but if you're following along. So let's see how this works again. After I made some of these changes, just so we can see it a little more clearly. I just added more rotation so that it'll be a little bit more drastic of a rotation. Press play. So it's waiting for me to press the play button. I'll press the play to get it going. Okay, we have an orange ball. I'll allow it, I'll move the orange bucket underneath. Now again, it is cycling through here just really, really quickly. We'll see a change here on the third one. You can see the rotation happen there. And a little bit more of a rotation. Now you see what's happening is the balls are coming a lot faster, making it a lot more difficult. Now the reason why we do 2 degrees to begin with is that when you're in VR, they start coming at you really, really quickly. So that's why I recommend to keep it at 2. And then this, because 2 degrees doesn't take a long time to move, 70 milliseconds is fine. But again, you can mess with this. It's not going to really make much of a difference to the game itself or the functionality of the game. One thing you got to make sure is that you want to make sure this relative is clicked. The reason why, if that is not clicked, it's always just going to set the rotation to 2. And so relative means it's adding on 2 degrees relative to its current position. So that's what that actually means. So that's a really important one. Otherwise, you won't see a change after the first one. So that concludes this video and this behavior where we just created a counter that will then rotate the table, making it more difficult as you progress through the scene. In the next video, we are going to add an HTML 3D entity to our scene so we can start experimenting how we can add a counter. So we just created a counter. Now we want to display the counter up somewhere within our scene. So we're going to work on that. We're also just going to quickly show you how to add a video to your scene. If you wanted to add some sort of instructions or something like that, that's a really simple thing that we can do, and we will be doing that in the next video. So I hope you join us.